Well, the Nationals leader David Littleproud has hit back at suggestions that the Nationals are to blame for the current gas crisis or energy crisis somehow. There's pressure for the government to enact the so-called gas trigger, but the coalition believes it wouldn't need to be pulled if the government could pick up the phone with gas companies and come to a faster agreement. Joining me live now is the Nationals leader David Littleproud. David, before we get to the energy crisis, I think we can call it a crisis at this point. I want to talk about the reshuffle and the shadow cabinet. You got 6 spots. How'd you do that?
Look, that's around negotiation, and obviously very proud of the fact that within that 6 there are 3 women. But even prouder also is the fact that we brought trade back to the National Party family. It has a great and long tradition in the National Party. Blackjack McEwen did a great job as Trade Minister and as Prime Minister of this country for 40-odd days. So to bring that back was no mean feat, and one in which I actually respect and thank Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party in understanding that the National Party deserves 6 spots, but also that trade is a natural fit for us. It actually encompasses much of the communities we represent. So very proud of that, and very happy. And Kevin Hogan will do an outstanding job as Trade and Tourism Minister.
Yeah, but you've had to push aside another country Liberal in Dan Tehan. Did you have to twist Peter Dutton's arm to get that done?
Oh, no, look, in terms of the discussions, they're obviously robust, but forthright, and Peter and I have known each other for a long time, and we've always been respectful to one another, respected the ideology of each of our parties, and understood that we can only win this next election if we work together, and that's the ethos that Peter and I will bring through, the discipline and ethos that we want to bring through the party to make sure that we're not just holding the government to account, but we're now about formulating the policies that will attract people back to us at the next election. It's not just about knocking. It's also about putting a cogent argument about why people should change their vote from whether that be independent, the Labor, to us. And that's why it's important we work on that as well as hold the government to account.
You speak of respecting each other's ideology. When you see this current energy crisis in Australia, there's this narrative that is creeping in that the reason we're here, or it's being used as a reason, not to put forward greater plans on tackling climate change. Do you believe that's why we're in this situation? And do you prescribe to that belief that maybe you need to pull back a bit?
No, why we're in this predicament is 100 days ago, it's just over 100 days ago, there was a war initiated by Russia on the Ukraine. And that sent international markets into a spin and obviously supply into a spin. So you've got to understand that we were on a trajectory to solve this in terms of our investment in gas, in the infrastructure we were going to put in place to make sure that gas was able to there was going to be a greater domestic supply and be distributed across the country. We've invested with the Northern Territory government, who I congratulate on the Beetaloo Basin, and Queensland government, with credit's due, 4 or 5 years ago, they put out tenements just for domestic supply. So we're about making sure that we can get that supply and provide that supply domestically. And you've got to understand, even if you want to shift towards renewables, you do need to be able to have a quick shift towards baseload power, particularly with gas that has the ability to turn off on and off quickly.
Yeah.
And the other piece that the
Nationals will be
prosecuting very strong.
And with coal you can't do that, can you? And that's in part why we're seeing some of these coal-fired power stations break down, essentially, because it is not the coal is not something that's designed to switch on and off. It was meant to be running 24 hours a day.
No, it's not, and unfortunately there's been a de-investment in our coal-fired power stations when you can actually invest in retrofitting them, getting them to Healy plants, but also carbon capture storage. And I think the other piece that we need to have, there's a short-term problem that we've got to fix and the government needs to fix, but there's also a long-term solution about reducing emissions, and that's the technology. But that's also the conversation that I want to start in this new political construct, or that Anthony Albanese has espoused, is that there needs now to be a conversation about nuclear. Nuclear energy won't happen overnight, and we're not suggesting that'll happen overnight. It won't be on everyone's corner overnight. But over the next 5 to 10 years, we have the opportunity to look at new technologies, emerging technologies, and see whether that can be done in Australia to reduce emissions, to give us baseload power, to complement renewables, but also to invest in those traditional industries as well, to reduce emissions, to give us cheap, affordable energy.
Okay, so David Littleproud, at this point, can we assume that you have struck a coalition agreement with Peter Dutton and the Liberals, and can we also assume that nuclear might be part of that?
We have a coalition agreement, and Peter and I have been very clear on that. And I understand that nuclear is at the moment a step too far for many of the political parties. And we're not throwing this down people's throats. We're simply saying, let's create the environment for a constructive conversation with the community about nuclear energy and the role that it can play into the future. And we did extensive polling about 2 years ago on this and understood that it wasn't as popular because, in fact, people were getting their information from what they saw on Chernobyl and Fukushima, but also the Simpsons. And that's the level of information that's out there that people need to understand. And that came through in the polling, which was frightening.
What do you mean?
And so what we need to do...
hang on, whoa. People are being informed by the Simpsons?
There's this perception... But there's this perception that's been put around nuclear that's gone back as far as Chernobyl, and then obviously etched into folklore through cartoons where people have just into their psyche haven't thought about it and simply walked away and thought we've got reliable energy here, we don't need to do it. Well, we're having a real conversation about reducing emissions and having baseload, and that's what the actual the polling found. It was quite extensive. There was over 1,200 people, 1,300 people on the eastern seaboard that was surveyed on that. So now is the opportunity to educate before you even think about legislating. But you can only do that if there's a political construct in this country whereby the political leaders put their hand up and say, let's take a step back and let's educate and let's bring the community with us. And if they decide at the end of that no, they don't want to go down small-scale modular nuclear, that's emerging technology starting to come through now. If they don't want to do that at the end, well, that's okay. But our job as political leaders is to actually take away the angst and the anxiety of debate and a conversation and to step forward and say, let's create that environment. And that's what I'll be asking all political leaders, as well as the Liberal Party. I know they're not quite there yet, but we are as a national party, and we think that's eminently sensible.
Well, you had a decade, to be fair, and not to be rude, but why didn't you have this as part of the coalition, both major parties' major election platform?
Well, the community doesn't trust nuclear at the moment, and this is where I say you've got to educate before you legislate.
Right.
And I'm not saying I've got all the answers.
And you need a mandate, though, don't you?
Let's create. Well, you do, but I think you can only get that if there's political leadership, not just from the National Party, but from all political leaders to say, let's create that political construct where a conversation can be had in a sensible environment, taking away the extremities of both sides of the debate and being able to work through it and bring the community with it. And that's not going to happen overnight. We're not saying that'll happen overnight. We're saying that has to be a journey that has to start now. And I'm going to take Anthony Albanese up on his offer to have a different political construct and ask him to be mature about this and to engage in this, because I think it's an important discussion about our energy reliability and reducing our emissions. We're a smart country and we should back ourselves with the best science and the best minds in the world to be able to achieve this, not today, but down the track.